Hello friends, connected and concerned. It's a nice name, isn't it? I thought I'd like to have a chat this afternoon. Some things have been on my mind since that BBC article was published. Many of us thought it may convince the staunch dismissers that there is a problem that needs to be acknowledged. Not so, it seems. I've called this chat Making Sense of Theology. First part is how we make sense of ourselves and others and our world. The second part is theology, the window through which we see God. I hope it doesn't come across as too teachery. You are free to switch it off, of course, if it is. We make sense of what we see, hear, taste, touch and smell through a process called pattern matching. Matching that sensory material with a pattern already on file that tells us it is like. Our son Roger, about 3 years old at the time, he was on his hands and knees looking at a string of hairy caterpillars on the footpath. And he looks up and he says, "Hey, look, Dad, there's a train." Now what he's saying in effect is there's a train-like thing. The closest match in his young mind was Thomas the Tank Engine with the carriages behind. Now over time, more patterns are added and it becomes a vast library enabling him to make distinctions between trains and caterpillars, wheels and hairy legs and so on. Without a pattern, sense making is not possible. Our sense organs, ears for example, are like a barcode scanner in the supermarket. They don't know anything, but they send the code to the data bank, and from a vast array of possibilities, they find a perfect match. Now, people refusing to acknowledge CSA have a pattern for understanding it that is different to many of us here. It's like Walmart, or if in the UK, Tesco, and for my Aussie mates, Coles. It's a barcode scanner for, say, a bottle of peroxide, corrosive and dangerous. And over the road, Kroger or Sainsbury's or Woolies, they have the same barcode, but it says that it's hair shampoo, soft and shiny. Same code being read, but the meaning in each person is different. No point in trying to convince the other or getting exasperated. Agreement is not possible unless at a very basic sense-making level we can both agree the thing we are talking about is peroxide. Now for this agreement, the CSA ignorers will need a new pattern, one which sees it in a very different way, different to the way they had before. What they thought was shampoo is actually peroxide. And sorry to say, reading the BBC article or us talking about it probably won't do this. Patterns are linked with emotions and as such are below awareness, before thought and before language. New ones can only be added using the language of the emotional brain, metaphor, and even then only in a relaxed meditative state. You will probably agree talking CSA arouses emotion in both the concerned and the ignorers, and the more emotional we become, the less sophisticated our thinking becomes. So if the BBC article is not likely to bring acknowledgement of CSA, how could it happen? How can we help people develop new patterns to help them make sense of it with better level of understanding? As the disagreement is an emotional problem rather than an intellectual problem, there is only one way, and that is using metaphor or stories with metaphors embedded in them. Not stories of victims' dreadful experience, that hasn't changed what they think about it, but metaphorically rich stories. That's how Jesus taught, and it works at a deep sense-making level. Perhaps one day I'll write a story as an example. Now on to theology. I knew it only as a word for more than 50 years. Seems to me good professing folks didn't need to think about what it meant. Theology is a window through which we view God. It is in place whether we think about it or not. Looking back, the window was pretty small, so I didn't see much. God was present in my thinking, but I didn't know him in any relational sense. Had I thought about it, my theology was essentially a product of its times, basically Reformed fundamentalist. The King James Bible was all I needed, and I shied away from doctrinal discussions with worldly people because they used terms like penal substitution, sovereignty of God, the Apostles' Creed, the rapture, and so on. I was clueless as to what they were talking about. Clueless about William Irvine too, the man who more than anyone else developed a theology that still holds people to its ideology to some extent or another. A theology of a limited God, having chosen only a small group of people to call his own, an embracing of the idea that all other belief systems are false, a confusion over what Jesus actually accomplished on the cross, a limited awareness of the Holy Spirit, a rejection of Trinitarian thought, and bondage to the idea of salvation is by works, not grace. An ideal set of beliefs for me, spiritually anaesthetised as I was. Theology has a long and tedious history from about the 3rd century onwards. Before that, the early church, meaning the people who spread the gospel all over the known world, not necessarily the church leaders, they had a view of God they understood from what they were told about Jesus, what he said, what he did, and what happened. They loved the retelling of the Sermon on the Mount, and they lived by it. I say retelling intentionally because they were nearly all illiterate. Oral testimony was all they had. They also loved hearing psalms recited, and what has been found inscribed in oak floorboards and carved in stone is the phrase, "Swords into ploughshares, spears into pruning hooks, you will sit together under your vines and there will be no more war." Just think about that in this present time. They took this as an article of faith and lived by the hope that it offered. They saw all that they needed through this window view of God. So what happened to this theology? Surely the purest form we have ever seen. Well, if you cut me a little slack here, I'll give you Merv's view of what happened. The first big theology came from Augustine. He was a wonderful thinker and a writer, a lawyer by profession, so he was able to formalise the various views of God. But he, more than anyone else, destroyed the early church view of God. You see, he was a passionate ambassador for the gospel, and he was also associated with the aristocracy of the times. He found that while his upper-class friends found Jesus attractive, there was always one sticking point to baptism and complete belief. You see, they all had private armies and they could not countenance this love your enemies stuff. So Augustine, anxious to accommodate them, instituted the doctrine of a just war. In other words, ignoring what Jesus said and what the early church embraced as a way of life, and of course the rest is history. Not a good history. What may seem a pretty minor adjustment to what Jesus said, it had a huge and enduring impact on theologies that followed. A just war idea enabled the church to define enemies of the church and persecute them to death, such as the Inquisitions. It enabled them also to claim when war broke out that God is on their side. Both Christians and Muslims, they claim the same God and that he was sanctioning not merely a just war, but a holy one. It's bizarre and tragic. Such are the dangers of bad theology. People get hurt, disillusioned and killed. In a way, Luther made it worse. In breaking from the Catholic Church, he defined enemies as Catholics, Jews, heretics, and anybody who didn't think like him. The good people, bad people, and the us versus them ideology was now firmly in the DNA of theology. Then Calvin came along, and he put Luther's doctrine on steroids. Also a lawyer, Calvin articulated a theology that spread all over Europe. The Scots particularly took up Calvin's ideas with a passion, and they formulated the Westminster Confession of Faith, the doctrinal statement that underpins much of Reformed evangelical theology, read most mainstream Protestant churches today. I read of many concerned and connected friends going through a process of reassessment, moving away from what they used to believe in, uncertain about what to believe in now, and somewhat afraid of where this is all headed. How then do we make sense of all this? The same way we make sense of everything else, matching what we see, hear and feel with what patterns we already have on file in our brain. And when it is unlike anything we've ever experienced before, the confusion and the uncertainty is dissipated by new patterns. What tells us this is like, what we thought was like peroxide is in reality hair shampoos, and vice versa. Easier said than done. I mentioned earlier, new patterns come from a meditative, relaxed state, not a state of anxiety or agitation. And because we're talking pre-thought and pre-language, it is not an intellectual, rational, word-driven pursuit as much as it is a waiting game. There is no hurry. God has loved us for years and accommodated our small window view of him. There's no rush and go and find ourselves another spiritual home. For let me tell you, most of them will still have a theology that misrepresents God. No point in rejecting Irvine's theology and then attaching ourselves to something with the same genetically problematic DNA. I often use the term, be prepared to walk over new ground, for it is the novel and unfamiliar that awakens our thinking and feeling. Be ready for the weird to become something entirely beautiful. I know a man whose journey into Christ began with an intense study of Rembrandt's painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. I remember the deep impression the story made on me when I saw it acted out by biblical storytellers. I'd have heard the story in mission year after year. My point is, language and intellect can only take us so far. We need to explore the realm of the mystics and try and see what they saw. A while back on the main chat, not sure if you saw it, had the phrase, "Show me the Bible verses." And a little while later, the story of Jesus healing the invalid. The study of verses will consolidate the patterns we already have. Listening to the story has the potential to make new ones. We all read chats differently, but I'm sure I'm not the only one that reads somewhat dispassionately the verse after verse, the scripture used to support an idea or position already firmly held, and then along comes a story, and I sit up and listen. I used to watch for this same thing at convention, probably you did too. Da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. Then, I remember one time with my companion, and every head would look up. And if the story was gripping enough, like Willie Pollock's, for example, the whole building went quiet. It was like a net shot out and everyone was caught up in the intensity of the moment. I guarantee you've seen that, experienced that. New patterns being made because you can bring to mind those stories and they affect you. And all these years later, you can still remember them. Yes, friends, let's not get exasperated if people don't see what we see. and I hope my explanation of how we make sense of things has been somewhat helpful. Let's focus on opening the window through which we see God. Let him reframe the window so we get to know and relate to him better. If you didn't switch off at the beginning, thanks for your time, and God bless you all.